Okay, dear friends, dear guests, dear panelists, dear moderator, welcome on behalf of all my colleagues and myself to this session and to our last day of the POLIS Conference. Today we will talk about the future of the charging infrastructure. And before we actually start, I would like to take you through some housekeeping rules. On the next slide, indeed. So we hope to have a very lively session. We hope to have comments and questions from you. All your questions and comments are welcome in the chat of the session. So it's very important that you stay in the chat of the session. We have seen 2 polls for you, and these 2 polls launched at a certain time, and this when Anna, our moderator, introduces the polls, you're invited to go to the polls again of the session. Okay, you can also see the people who are attending the session by going to the people section. And do not forget to explore our networking function and to visit our exhibition area. And maybe last thing is that we will take your questions to the panelists during the foreseen Q&A sessions. And we have 2, and Anna will give you more information on this. But it would be helpful if you mention in your question to whom you address your question as well. I wish all of us a great session, and I would like to give the floor to our moderator, Anna Domènech. Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sabina. Good morning, everyone. And thank you so much for joining us on the last day of the POLIS Annual Conference. As Sabina said, I'm Anna Domènech. I manage innovation partnerships at Nissan Europe, and I'm also leading the Intelligent Mobility for Energy Transition initiative, sponsored by the Smart Cities Marketplace of the European Commission. But today, I'm here to moderate this amazing panel about future-proof e-charging infrastructure, where we will be discussing about what is required to deploy this infrastructure in terms of governance, standards, interoperability, public investments, etc. On this slide, you can see the great lineup we have for this panel today. But before we enter into the panel discussions, I'd like you to check the poll sections, where you will find an interesting question I want to ask to all of you, because I want to know you better. If you could switch today to EV, would you do it? If not, why not? We will check the answers later, but I can anticipate already that if we want to meet the very ambitious targets for climate that Europe has set, we will need to make an effort to improve to increase the positive answers to these questions. And that's actually the goal of the panel discussion we have today. We want you to come away from this panel with some ideas, a fresh perspective on what you can do to contribute to the electrification of the mobility. Just to give you some highlights about the format. The session is split into 2 parts. Both of them have the same structure. Brief introduction, some presentations, and then Q&A session in which you can all participate by sending some questions through the chat. On the first part of the session, we will focus on governance. We will have 4 presentations elaborating on different approaches to governance at European, national, and local level. After that, we will have a Q&A session and 30 minutes coffee break. During this time, you can have the chance to visit the expo. Many projects that are funded by the European Commission displayed, and they are all obviously about mobility. On the second part of the session, we will focus on public funding and other specific actions public authorities can do to support the deployment of a smart charging infrastructure. I'd like to highlight that the Q&A session in this second part of the session will be including all the speakers we had along the day. So that's the most lively part of the session, and that's why you should all stay until the very end of this panel discussion. Well, I think that's all for now. I hope it's clear, and let's get started with the panel then. I give the word to our first speaker, who is Jasmeet Khurana, Manager for Mobility at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Hello, Yasmit.
Hi, Anna. Thank you for introducing me. I hope you can all hear me. Okay, today I'll be talking about scaling up of adoption of electric vehicles under the new normal, which is once we get through and to the other side of the pandemic. Just very quickly on who I am and what I'm representing. I'm Jasmeet, and I'm representing the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. My day job, as I like to call it, is to support acceleration of EV adoption, specifically in India, but I also work on some parts and manage some parts of our global work on decarbonization of mobility at WBCSD, and it's the latter that I'll be representing today. If you can just move to the next slide very quickly on who we are. So the World Business Council for Sustainable Development is a global not-for-profit. We are a membership-based organization where 200 global companies come together with a common vision to create a world where 9 billion people can live well within the planetary boundaries by 2050. So that's who we are. I mean, I'll not spend too much time explaining the other things, but just moving on to the context today. We are in a pandemic, passing through it and hope to get to the other side. We know that countries and regions are taking this unfortunate incident, but also using it as an opportunity to build back better or build forward better, as we like to call it. We know in Europe, in different markets, there are these Green New Deals, which are accelerating all sorts of new technologies and new ways of living, including incentives for electric vehicles in a lot of markets, which have come up as a part of this stimulus package to revive the economy and to bring back the jobs. So that's a big trend which is shaping the new world that we are going to enter. In terms of capital flows, it's clear where the direction is in terms of where the money is headed. The chart that you see on the top right of your screen shows in the middle the black line, which kind of appears straight, but it's a 700+% jump in the share prices of Tesla, and the line kind of going way above is actually a company called NIO from China, where again the increase is over 1,500 to 1,700%, and the bottom line, if you can see it in orange, it's actually a decrease of -38% for the shares of ExxonMobil. So we don't know whether it's a bubble, we don't know where it will go, but at least the direction is fairly clear that the world is moving towards a new form of mobility and the new energy source to power it. There are other mobility patterns which have been fast-tracked. We know that deliveries, which are an excellent use case for adoption of electric vehicles, have increased. Even on personal adoption, more and more people are much more conscious about their own footprint after having seen clear skies. I live in Delhi and I've seen clear skies for the first time in so many winters. And people are conscious that they are having an impact and they can make a change. And the national ambitions which are being announced, for example, the UK ambition to phase out ICE vehicles by 2030, which again will help or support other countries to take similar steps. Just moving on into the topic for today around mobility and electrification of mobility. So I think the key thesis that we are working on is how do we unlock value within this transition. And when I say value, it's the intrinsic value which lies at the intersection of mobility, real estate, and energy. So what I mean by that is that currently the mobility sector, the real estate sector, and the energy sector are taking their own paths and their own views on how this transition should happen, on what their role should be. But there are very clear and unquestionable reasons for why these sectors should be collaborating to unlock value, both to strengthen the business case for a faster adoption of EVs, but also to make the fleets more efficient, to improve management of space, to enable grid management, to increase the adoption of renewables, and to help attract capital. I'll go into a little bit of more detail on how this should be thought about, and many of the same things that you see in the subsequent slides will be, I mean, these are things which are there in plain sight, but still not happening in a way that they should. Let me first look at fleets and their interaction with charging. So fleets and charging from a mobility standpoint and from a energy standpoint have a beautiful kind of symphony or synergy between them. Fleets have all of this data, and I'm talking about kind of larger fleets, corporate fleets and other kind of use cases, and personal adoption obviously kind of can piggyback on it. But some of these large fleets, ride hailing and other fleets, they have all of this data of where their vehicles are going, where do they need chargers, what kind of models do they want to adopt, where are their cars parked. So all of this data is available. How can we use that data by making a fleet company and a mobility company work with a charge point operator to make sure that charging becomes more viable, right? It's very simple. All of this data exists. Charging companies would love to have this data to plan their charging, but we just need to make it happen, just some market norms and market rules around how that happens. Similarly, fleet operators stand to benefit a lot from this as well, right? If these charging stations are based in the right locations, they reduce their dry run. Every kind of 5 hours, they're saving money by that because they don't have to drive to a location which is far away, or they're driving to a location which is close by, and they're getting power at a rate which is kind of the cheapest. So this interaction between charging and fleets is an excellent kind of way in which collaboration can happen and should happen. We need to figure out how these partnerships will work, what kind of agreements need to be activated to enable some of these long-term collaborations. And in the next slide, we'll kind of expand this a little bit to bring in elements of grid management, vehicle to grid, RE integration, and just the relationship between charging and the grid. Now, of course, the first thing that we need to do is to maximize utilization, right? Which is the interaction between fleets and the charging point. But how do we, what are the market rules under which grid is being upgraded because it needs to be upgraded? Yeah, thanks, Anna, for pointing out, and I'll just move through it quickly. But we need the market rules to make sure that grid upgradation which needs to happen, who needs to pay for what? Does a fleet operator need to pay for grid upgradation or not? How can fleets be monetized if they provide services to the grid? These are all things that can happen today. We just need the market rules to make them happen. If we move to the next slide, again, looking at space, we know that charging increases the value of a parking spot because people park there, they can shop there, they can do other things, they can park and ride if it is related to a public transport. So the space and its management can be improved, and the value of space can be improved by bringing in charging and having collaboration between the charge point operators and those who manage space. So the real estate, we need to make both of them smarter. And if you move to the next slide, we add on to that an element of intermodality, which comes back to the interaction between mobility and the fleets and the space, which is the real estate operators. And in the next slide, we look at how all of this kind of comes together. This is just a draft of some of our thinking on how collaborations need to happen. It's all in plain sight. There's nothing new or rocket science in this. It's just about making the market rules work so that value can be unlocked at the intersection of these three sectors, which is required for a faster adoption of EVs. With that, I'll close my discussion. Thank you. And Anna, back to you.
Thank you, Yasmit. I am looking forward to hearing more about your views on new business models and collaboration. That was a very inspiring presentation. Now I give the floor to Roland Ferwerda, Managing Director of NKL.
Good morning, or afternoon, or wherever you the presentation is up. I do not have it in front of me.
Claudia, we cannot see your presentation. Could you try to reshare your screen, please?
Perfect.
Okay, if you go to
Off to a
present.
good start.
Thank you. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. You can go forward 2 slides, please. Next one. Thank you so much. So my name is Roland Ferwerda. I'm director of the National Knowledge Platform for Charging Infrastructure in the Netherlands, a platform since 2014. It is supposed to be a temporary project organization, but already 6 years we found out that it helps to have some neutral, independent player in that innovative market to make sure that when things develop, we are careful. We look at lock-ins. We look at the developments to ensure that's a well-balanced situation, and we are sure that the speed up this market development for public charging by developing and disseminating the knowledge that is being developed by all the players in that sector. So that's a little bit about the National Knowledge Platform. It's public, so all the results are open source, and increasingly we move to English products as well. Next slide, please. So, yeah, this is a very brief overview of the public and private parties. Basically, are pretty much all the players that are currently acting in charging infrastructure. We see local and central public governments. It's branch sector organizations are there. It's knowledge institutions and grid operators. So really try to provide this balanced overview and create knowledge products that have the buy-in from everyone. Next one, please. So what I would like to talk to you a little bit about is that business case for public charging that we're focusing on, how to develop that and how to do that in some kind of a multi-stakeholder approach. What we found out today, well, we're already, I think in the Netherlands, 11 years on the way since we put the first charging station out there in 2009. Is that it's still a challenge to have a good and positive business case that does not need any subsidies. But it is our aim. In the Netherlands, we try to really work towards a open market which is competitive and which can support itself. So our focus, as we look at it today, is that we focus on sorry, maybe one back. Anna, thank you. Is that we focus on lowering that cost. That's a very important thing in order to have a good business case. Through harmonization, standardization, we improve the efficiency by making sure that the best available knowledge is being used, repurposed, but also to facilitate new earnings models. There are a lot of innovations going on, a lot of cross-sectoral developments. Also, the previous speaker mentioned something about that. And this is something we do on a pre-competitive level. And I thought of giving you some examples of these 3 elements to give you a glimpse in these 7 minutes. Thanks. So this is one example. If you cannot measure, you basically don't know where you are. So we developed cost benchmarks that we started putting out there since 2016. We also developed some kind of maturity model where over 10 different axes, we try to identify how mature is that market in terms of policy, in terms of financing, in terms of user-centric behavior, but also, let's say, when it comes to the development of knowledge and people. So we notice an increasing scarcity of the skills and competencies in the marketplace. Thank you. Another thing that we do is where we looked at all the contracting that's taking place today, and we try to develop a uniform standard for that. So basically, if you have contracting, concessions, whatever, permitting, that you can rely on this document to pick up, to basically pick up every requirement that you need. So maybe the next sheet shows a little example of that from a page. Basically, it's very small, but it says something about, about security, about the functionality, about the techniques, about the things that you should have required as a contractor or as a public player, for example, that wants to organize a concession or a tender on its public charging infrastructure. So we provide a whole list of requirements. So this is basically about standardization, harmonization. So the EV market protocol, market protocols is another interesting element of standardization, where we see that there's so many players going around there, and they all need to be connected on that information layer to provide their services. But we've seen a lot of divergence on the way they connect it, proprietary stuff. So we've been very focusing in the last years on, well, let's say OCPP first. ELAT's been doing a great job there, but also NKL has been working very hard on developing OCPI as the let's say roaming protocol. That's moved now to a separate foundation, the EV Roaming Foundation. But this has been our focus for the past years. Yeah, sorry, Anna. Please click through them. This is not. This is my mistake. It's a very explanatory sheet in it, which goes click by click. Thank you. Maybe the next one. Yes. So when we look at best practices and guidelines, we've been developing specific guidelines that support, let's say in this case, public governments on how to move towards the way of contracting or concession that they require. So we've created a guideline for vision and policy, but also more specific guidelines for charging plazas or charging hubs, if you want to call them. What options are there? What use cases are behind them? Which technical and functional solutions should you choose? And how to move ahead. So these are typical documents that we have available and that are of public use. Yeah. And maybe a little bit more detail on that that vision and policy guideline. So who is your customer? Who is charging? Mainly domestic drivers, a lot of business drivers, maybe even the small logistics vans. What is your ambition and role? We see very different ambitions. Some are very proactive, some are very defensive. Some want to invest money in them. Some cities are really relying on the open market as of day one. And there are options for that in contracting, but they're different. So, Anna, how much time do I have?
Run out of time.
I'm out of time. So maybe move to the second to last sheet then with some conclusions if you want. Yes, thank you. This one. So what we see here, if you want to take this multi-stakeholder approach on policy, and our focus is then first, it's public charging. The vision is important. Framework for an open market important. Interoperability is maximal efficiency. And we see that collaboration element being very, very, very important. So these are the elements. What I did not mention, my last words, is that our next year's challenge is logistics. Heavy duty, light duty, zero emission zones. So in the Netherlands, we found out, that the person vehicle, electrification person vehicles is pretty much on the way. Logistics is the big next thing for us. Thank you very much for your time. It's a teaser. Hope to follow up in the chat and offline.
Thank you, Roland. Will we all be able to access this information? Is it on your website?
Yes, it is on my website.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So our next speaker is Alexander Verduyn, Policy Officer on Alternative Fuel Infrastructure at Digimove.
Thanks, Anna, for introducing me. Thank you also for inviting me to the organizers. So today, I will, it's nice that I'm coming right after Roland, because the work we've been doing at EU level is building a bit on what the Netherlands has pioneered in terms of this multi-stakeholder approach. If you can move to the next slide, please. So we've been developing over the past year recommendations for procuring, awarding concessions, and granting aid for recharging points for passenger cars and vans. Next slide, please. I will briefly guide you through the process that we went through to develop this. So this was developed under the Sustainable Transport Forum, which is also a multi-stakeholder organization at EU level, where all the member states are involved and a number of mobility experts. We had obtained a mandate already last year to develop these recommendations, which were intended to be an easy-to-use toolkit, best practices guide for authorities, meant for public authorities, to help them with the procurement and concession awards for recharging points. So how did we distribute this work? The work was coordinated by us in Digimove with the support of TNO and POLIS also. TNO is a Dutch research organization. POLIS, well, I don't think I have to introduce them here today. And both of them are part of the EAFO consortium. So we also, the whole recommendations went through quite an extensive review throughout the year with the help of some cities in the core review team. You see them listed here, and a number of expert organizations, amongst which also NKL, because of their expertise, of course, in the Netherlands. And then the final review, actually, the final approval took place 2 days ago by the Sustainable Transport Forum plenary. Next slide, please. So what was our objective of this exercise? Very similar to what Roland just described of NKL. So we want to disseminate knowledge, avoid the mistakes made by others, and spread best practices. To help, of course, save public resources by procuring the state-of-the-art infrastructure that is ready for, let's say, the upcoming technological developments in the market, and also to avoid stranded investments, of course. So, of course, and also an important objective was to harmonize or at least provide guidance for harmonization and interoperability for infrastructure through these recommendations, which are, of course, not binding, but still we expect that many authorities will at least take them into account when they procure infrastructure. And in doing so, of course, support the uptake of EVs throughout the EU. And a last very important objective as well was to help the recharging market develop as a competitive market. For those who read the recommendations, they will see that competition is one of the let's say red threads throughout the report. Next slide, please. So then going to the content, since I have only 7 minutes and this is these recommendations count more than 140 pages, I will have to be very, let's say, brief and try to lure your interest into reading them. Next slide, please. So, next slide, please. Yeah. First, so the scope, we look at, as I already mentioned, good practice, bad practice. Also mentioned that it's about public procurement for and on concession awards, license awards, and government support for publicly accessible infrastructure. That's an important element. And indeed, focusing on recharging infrastructure for passenger cars and vans. Next slide, please. Then looking at a brief overview of what is in those recommendations. So first of all, we look at different approaches of public authorities in defining the deployment approach. So the recommendations were built on the experience of public authorities, so they provided the input for this report. And then in particular, we looked at the front runners who have, of course, already extensive experience in deploying infrastructure. So we looked at the different mobility strategies and possible synergies between them, highlighting these, of course, in the report, looking at best practices in terms of cooperation between public authorities, not only within the same member state, but also across borders, and also within the member state between different levels of government. And then, and of course, a very important aspect is looking also at what is a suitable recharging network. Looking at, for example, limiting grid connection cost by using already available infrastructure. Looking at the best locations, what kind of infrastructure should be deployed, what power requirements infrastructure should have, in linking that, of course, then again to the locations, etc. Then we also looked at organizing the tender procedure itself. So first of all, a very first question is who does what? Of course, it's not always public authorities that need to or should procure infrastructure. Other instruments exist. We see that a number of public authorities also have the approach that the market should simply deliver. And then, of course, we compare a bit where uptake is of course, fastest. And which approach is, let's say, best to fostering the uptake of e-mobility and also, of course, deployment of recharging infrastructure. And last but not least, in that chapter, we also look quite extensively into fostering competition in the recharging market. We propose a number of approaches that authorities can use. For example, using let's say the price that will be charged to end consumers as an award criterion, which is, let's say, specifically important in cases where public authorities, let's say, provide exclusive concessions for certain areas. Next slide, please. I will briefly show you what we have in terms of specific tender requirements in the report. So I don't know if you can see this. It's quite small. Can you click, please? So first we look at, this is an overview from Germany, where you see different aspects related to recharging infrastructure. There's much more behind it than just simply installing a recharging point. So first of all, we look at accessibility, best practices in terms of requiring, for example, 24/7 openness, but also looking at accessibility to people with reduced mobility. Next, please. We also look at interoperability of the hardware. This is mainly already standardized by EU legislation. Next. We look at software interoperability. That is the communication protocols, for example, that Roland was already discussing. Looking at, let's say, where the market is going in terms of harmonization in that respect. Next. I'll try to be brief. We look at finding infrastructure, data regarding infrastructure. And then next, we look also at making sure that recharging points and recharging places, parkings, are easily recognizable. And last but not least, penultimately, we look at renewable sourcing of electricity and also at requirements in terms of the end of the concession. Next slide, please. Very briefly, we also look at user-friendly infrastructure, making sure that infrastructure is there for the consumers, making sure that there is a support service, that infrastructure is not out of order, that you can easily pay at recharging infrastructure. We look at also making sure that prices are transparent and fair. And last but not least, as I already mentioned, we also look at making sure that infrastructure is future-proof, modularity of design, making sure that smart charging is possible in the future, and making cities also aware that wireless charging could reduce visual pollution in their streets. I think that's it for me, if I'm not mistaken. It's a very brief overview. So if you have additional questions, please ask them in the chat. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you, Alexander. I will definitely read this report. And now it's time to give the floor to the last speaker of the first part of this session, who is Peter Swart, at Arnhem City Council.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you for inviting me. POLIS, of course. Hi, my name is Peter Swart. I work for the city of Arnhem, and I'm also the project manager for the Clean Mobile Energy project. Next slide, please. Yes, thank you. The Clean Mobile Energy project has an aim to make sure that that renewable energy is used for charging of cars, and in the case of Arnhem, also delivering power to the ships in our harbor. And we do that through a interoperable energy management system, which I will explain briefly. Next slide, please. This is also about the whole the IEMS, because the IEMS is something we developed together with the other partners in our Interreg Northwest Europe project, together with Nottingham and Schwäbisch Gmünd. And this IEMS is actually the core of our project, because this is a software platform where we want to combine the production of renewable energy and storage with the charging of cars in Arnhem, for instance, and in Nottingham and in Schwäbisch Gmünd. Next slide, please. So these are the three city pilots I was mentioning. And these city pilots have big differences, because in Arnhem we use this interoperable energy management system to make sure that the renewable energy from a solar field is used in the cars. In Nottingham, it's in cars all over the city, I must say. And in Nottingham, it's used to provide the maintenance fleet of the municipality with energy. And the big difference is that in Nottingham, it's all behind 1 meter, one connection to the grid. And in Arnhem, it's throughout the whole city. And in Schwäbisch Gmünd, we are aiming at charging light electric vehicles and electric bikes. Next slide, please. So this is zooming in towards the city pilot in Arnhem. In Arnhem, we will have a solar farm next year of 10 megawatts. We already purchased a storage facility of 500 kilowatt hours, and the installation of the cold ironing, which is the shore-to-ship power appliances, is already in place. And what's more important for this discussion, of course, is the EV charging in Arnhem. What you see here on the left, top left, is a charging plaza in Arnhem. And actually all the 250 charging stations we have in Arnhem will be connected to the IEMS. And for this purpose, we are discussing this with Allego, which is our charge point operator at the moment. And Allego is providing all the data almost real time of all the charging infrastructure in Arnhem to the IEMS, so that we know when we can give them the suggestion to start charging their cars, because there is some solar energy coming their way. The most important point of this energy management system is that because we are using the grid and because we do not own all the assets, we cannot actually do interventions like turning down the power of the charging infrastructure in Arnhem. We have to suggest that to the CPO, because he operates and is exploiting the charging infrastructure in Arnhem. But we are very confident that we're closely cooperating with them. We're very confident that we will be able to make sure that the solar power is used for the charging of the cars in Arnhem. But for this purpose also, of course, Allego needs to develop something which is called a preferred supplier. And through the app Allego is using for charging cars, they can give the EV drivers the choice between energy suppliers. And of course, one of those energy suppliers will be the solar farm in Arnhem itself. That's very important to realize that, because that's what you could call smart charging, because we also want to make sure that in the evening, you can use the solar energy which has been produced during the day and which has been stored in the facility at the bottom right. We can use that in the evening to charge the cars in the upper left corner. Thank you. Next slide, please. Here you see an example of how the energy management system actually works. You can see on the left all the different attributes, as they call them, which are present in this software program. which is all about optimization for because we do this because we want to make sure that all cars in Arnhem are charged with 100% renewable energy to have carbon savings, of course, in our city. On the left, on the right, you see an example of how the battery can be used. You see there that the yellow at the left is the charging of the battery, and you see further in the day, because that's a day. You see the discharging of the battery for charging the cars in the city. Next slide, please. And here you have one example also of the dashboard of the IMS, which shows the attribute of the storage facility. So here you can make sure that all the things you want the storage facility to do, for instance, reacting on solar power or giving energy to the grid if it's not needed elsewhere in the city, maybe to make some money on the frequency market. So that's all kinds of things you can do with it, IMS, which is, of course, the software program which will direct all the power to the right place at the right time. Next slide, please. Yes, this is more in detail the differences between Nottingham and the city pilot in Arnhem. But what is actually the most important question, especially in Arnhem, is that when you are using the grid and you are not owner of all the assets, how can you make sure that your goals are achieved, and who is authorized, so to speak, to direct the power to the different locations and sort of trade the power internally in the city? Because that's a difficult question. We're not really sure how we are going to tackle that, but we are now currently, as I said, talking to the CPO. We're also, of course, talking to the people from the shore-to-ship power, and we are trying to make a viable business case of this, because in the end, we as a public authority do not want to be the one turning the knobs and making the decisions about power, but we want a market player to do that and take over from us. So that's the big question we also want to discuss in the discussion today. Yes, you can go to the last slide. Yes. Thank you for your attention. Here you can find some more information on the Clean Mobile Energy project on the Northwest Europe website. And of course, you can contact me if you have any questions about the IEMS and how we are going to use it. Thank you very much. Over back to you, Anna.
Peter, that was a presentation, and actually I've been following the Clean Mobile Energy project closely. I'm looking forward to see the results of the project and how the energy management system can improve our systems. So now I will kick off the Q&A session. I will invite all speakers to join the stage. So Yasmit, Roland, Alexander, Peter, and also Simon and Jordan, who will be speaking at the next part of the session. I would really like to count with their opinions as well in the discussion. So while everyone joins us, I will just check the results of the poll, about electric vehicles and whether the audience would switch to them today. They are quite surprising because, well, first of all, the audience is quite divided. There is a big percentage that don't really need a car, so it's not an issue in terms of deploying electromobility. But then for those that need a car, there are some that, yes, they would take an EV today, but then the others are split between EVs are too expensive and EVs don't enjoy enough charging infrastructure. To be honest, I expected much more people complaining about the lack of charging infrastructure, but what's your opinion?
Well, I might react. I was one of the people who said I'm not going to buy an EV because it's too expensive. As a private person, I must say, of course, yeah. But so, I'm sure that in Arnhem, it's not a lack of charging infrastructure.
But you have nice incentives to buy EVs in Netherlands.
Yeah, but it's still not enough, I think. But that's my personal opinion. Maybe Roland has another opinion about this.
Well, yeah, the research says that total cost of ownership, there was today the ANWB, they gave a report that it's becoming more and more interesting for private persons. They a value per kilometer, and it's only a few tens of cents that the EV is expensive. But I think I agree, Peter, that total cost of ownership is different when as a private person you need to pay cash up front.
Exactly, you have to invest. Yeah.
So there are a lot of lease constructions, of course, and we see the decline in battery costs. So I'm very confident about the near future.
Mm-hmm. You're muted.
You're muted, yeah.
I wanted to say that let's kick off and give the opportunity to the audience to ask questions to you. The first question is addressed to Roland. On your list of what should be in concession tenders, could you please expand on how public authorities should do when a tender concession is ending, what they should take into account? And now public authorities have a key role in the rollout of infrastructure. What will be their role in the future? So a couple of questions, actually.
Answer in the chat. So when concessions end, we see that it depends a bit on the ownership structure. But usually the charging stations fall back to the city, and city can do a new concession for exploitation and maintenance of these charging stations. I think as Peter is doing for Arnhem, for example.
Yeah.
What you see is that they there's today into the offices or the IT systems of the CPO. So we as NKL, we try to prevent the lock-in market where new concession, provides a level playing field. So we workflow tool for that that allows that puts the EV drive municipality central, and the CPOs should hop in on that one. When you look at the role of public authorities, I think they're hugely important. I think they if they have the ambition and the vision, they can start with a strategically placed network. They can further densify, and depending on the strategy, they can just place chargers whenever new EV drivers come around and they request one in the public space. Or what you see today is that on data-driven information, they can proactively place new chargers.
Yeah.
This is more costly, of course, because they don't immediately have the amount of kilowatt hours that provides a positive business case. But it's just ambition in these big urban areas to provide clean air to their citizens and thus invest in this proactive rollout approach.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think the role of the public authority also in the future is quite large because, well, anyway in the Netherlands, because 60% of the charging will be done in the public space, and we want to make sure that the public space is up for that, of course, but also that the public space is not too much cluttered with charging infrastructure. So as Roland is saying, we're now proactively looking for ways to place charging infrastructure very clustered or with fast chargers, or anyway in such ways that the public space is not too much hindered by that.
If I may begin on this, what has not yet been mentioned, I agree with Roland and Peter, but of course it's also important to realize that up to this moment, recharging infrastructure is still largely financed also directly or indirectly through the public sector. So obviously the public sector has a big role in ensuring that infrastructure is indeed interoperable, suitable for consumers, installed at the right places, because often this is decided by public authorities still. And then you will see that in the recommendations that we've just adopted through the STF, that this is also one of the things we are looking at. What is the role for public sectors? Also, the other aspect, which Roland already answered on the end of the concession, is also something we look at, because we see that, let's say, the first important thing is to make make authorities aware of this problem, because often you see that they start deploying infrastructure without really thinking about the end of the concession or the end of the contract. So that's the first thing, to raise awareness about it.
Yeah.
And then, of course, indeed, secondly, as Roland was saying, it's important to make sure that it's modular. You can easily change, for example, the IT infrastructure, so that you don't have too many costs when you switch provider, and you avoid having these stranded assets.
Speaking of interoperability, yeah, I do have another question, because you know, the CPOs, they need to get a sustainable business models when it comes to private investment on charging infrastructure. And it's against interoperability, because interoperability right now damages their business model. How can we find the balance between creating a good business model to trigger more private investments, and at the same time having a more interoperable charging infrastructure, which is the best for our citizens?
Unless somebody else wants to take, maybe if I can briefly respond, I don't really agree with the statement that interoperability harms their business case, because the more infrastructure that is there, the more that is available to consumers, the easier uptake of EVs will be, and that is of course in the interest of everyone active in this market. So I think interoperability is in everyone's interest, and we also see that all the CPOs are actually actively looking to ensure interoperability. So I don't think this is correct. They're all involved also in the sustainable transport forum work we've been doing. They are really engaged to make sure that interoperability is possible. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. There's also a choice basically on where to provide competition. So I think European Commission was very thoughtful on removing competition on the type of plugs for cell phones, for example, so that you can make a very conscious decision on where you want to allow competition and where it's just not efficient.
Yeah. And to add to that, I think the competition really is on your phone and which app you're using on your phone to access charging, rather than on the plug itself. So I think the fight really, or the competition really is for the app that you're going to use to charge your car or charge your vehicle.
Wanted to add something?
Yeah, thanks. Simon from Flanders Region. I agree completely with Alexander that, in my opinion, it's not the case that interoperability and business case are in competition with each other. So I think interoperability is not really an issue in some countries anymore. I'm talking about the Netherlands and Belgium as well, although cross-border interoperability is still quite an issue. But business model is a discussion and really a key question, I think, and this will still be the case the next couple of years, because until now there is no such thing as a business model for public charging. We've seen it in Flanders as well. We have chosen to have a deployment system without public financing. So we had yearly concessions for a period of 10 years, but there was no public financing involved. And we really see that it's very hard to get a good business case for these chargers. Basically, what we need is more cars on the road, and then business models will follow. But this is not the case today, and in my opinion, it will not be the case the next coming years. So, yeah, the real question is, do we want to invest as public authorities in the charging infrastructure? Do we want the market to invest and have ecosystem? And how can we achieve this? So, yeah, this is a discussion that will continue the coming years, and it's a very relevant question in my opinion.
Let's get now another question from the audience.
Maybe to add a bit.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. Well, maybe a small statement. So when you look at the ability to charge everywhere, so to have maximum use of an existing charge point by allowing every driver to charge there, that's basically what interoperability means, or roaming, even roaming. That's also a conscious decision to say we need to kind of harmonize the protocols for information exchange for that. You know, we cannot allow different islands of interoperability to exist. It hurts the business case. It hurts the development of information services that I think for EV drivers.
And maybe I can add to that.
Simple but relevant focus.
Maybe I can add something to that, Ronald. Yes, I can add something to that because these open standards and open protocols are also very important for using renewable energy for charging your car. Because with the energy management system we use, of course we use the open protocols, which are used by the charge point operators. We need that very much.
Very good. A good platform for new innovations. A good open platform for new innovations such as these.
Yeah.
Okay, let's now give floor to the audience again. So what about the logistics and zero emission zones? What are the main challenges and possible next steps in this area? Who wants to answer?
Well, I can briefly say that I think yesterday, the day before yesterday, Rotterdam, which is a
Roland,
big city
we don't
in the
see you.
Netherlands of I think around 1 million. I think there's a connection bandwidth issue going on.
It's okay.
Right?
Yeah. It's okay. Just answer the question.
On, but I don't see everything. So, but they announced the zero emission zone I think 2 days ago. For them, it's the most important of all clean air and CO2.
Sound is not good, Roland.
So it's hugely important. Yet.
Anyone else can answer the question while Roland solves his issues?
If the sound is not good.
Yeah.
So WBCSD, I can answer that question. WBCSD has also been involved in the Rotterdam Zero Emission Zone project. We are coming at it from a data point of view. So the city wanted to understand what will be the economic impact of zero emission zones, specifically from a freight and logistics perspective.
And how we are coming into this on behalf of WBCSD is we are creating a data sharing platform which enables to capture some of this information on what kind of economic impact will be there if vehicles are asked out the zero emission zones, or when the zero emission zones are created, what kind of impact is it having economically in terms of goods being moved from one place to the other. But I think there are other challenges in other parts of the world on logistics and freight, which is kind of mostly related to availability of large commercial vehicles, which there are very few kind of models available. A lot of companies are trying to solve that, but I think from a global perspective, I think that's a very big challenge from a moving logistics to or larger format logistics to electric.
Thank you for your comprehensive answer, Jasmeet. Sorry. Another question from the audience to Peter, and I guess it refers to the pilot in Arnhem. Would it be possible in the future that also my solar panels on my roof could be connected to this storage facility to use it later to charge my EV? So to include citizens' production and consumption.
Actually, I also answered it briefly in the chat, but I can reiterate it now, of course. The next step for the CME project will be to see if we can use this IEMS, the Interoperable Energy Management System, also in neighborhoods. Because what we now do is we have now in the harbor in Arnhem, next to the solar field, and we're trying to provide it to the ships and to the charging infrastructure in Arnhem. But we also want to look at the neighborhood level and see if we can keep the energy produced, the renewable energy produced in the neighborhood, can keep it in the neighborhood itself. So what we're actually wanting to do is put a storage facility in a neighborhood, store the energy, which is surplus, of course, from the houses during the day, and see if we can use it in the evening to charge the cars in the same neighborhood. So that's something we want to investigate as a next step in Arnhem. And we're already doing a sort of feasibility study into that in one of the neighborhoods in Arnhem for that.
Thank you, Peter. Now there is an interesting reaction to the poll. Indeed, I actually don't need to own a car, but only to use it. So I want to use a shared EV when I need a car once in a while. And that comes to my question. What do you think about the business model for shared electric mobility? It's very difficult right now to balance the way the infrastructure to charge is organized with the location of the most, of the highest amount of potential clients for shared mobility, which are the people that live far away from the train stations, for instance. What do you think? Do you have any specific recommendation to deploy electric shared mobility?
Well, actually, maybe I can answer that. Sorry, Simon, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. In Flanders, we have quite some experience with shared electrified transport. We have set up a specific Green Deal for shared mobility, and it included also some ambitions on electric shared mobility. And we've seen a number of projects popping up in cities especially, but also more outskirts of city areas and even countryside. So we have a lot of examples, and we see actually that if you look at market shares of passenger cars in general, or market shares of EVs in shared cars, the market share in the shared car is much higher than the market share in passenger cars in general. So we see really an uptake of electric shared vehicles in Flanders, and it of course has to do with the number of cities who are really in the forefront of shared mobility. And I'm talking, for instance, about Ghent and Antwerp as well. And actually what we did is we deployed basic network of public charging infrastructure. So these were not initially used for shared mobility, but we see that in a number of cities we have a charger with 2 charging points, and in the meantime 1 charging point is used for shared mobility, because this helps with the business case for the operator, and it helps for the uptake of electric shared mobility in the city center. So this is one kind of temporary solution to help the uptake of shared mobility. We see that currently electric shared cars really need its own charging infrastructure, while you of course have also the free floating systems, but I'm talking more about the station-based systems now. So it's really needed, and it's really a condition for the success of shared mobility that they have their own charging infrastructure, and they can rely on the charging infrastructure and the availability of the charging infrastructure. So this is really a separate topic we have to focus on when deploying charging infrastructure. And yeah, you can do it in several ways with project calls. You can have for instance, what we want in the future is to have a system charger follows vehicle as we have for individuals, but deploy a similar system for shared mobility. So organizations who have electric shared cars, they can ask for charging infrastructure, for instance. This could be a system.
Yeah, maybe I can add a bit to that. And just before the break, I guess, Anna, is that we are currently cooperating with Leuven in Belgium in the eHubs project. And this has also led in Arnhem to some rules regarding shared electric mobility and charging. What we now say is when there are a couple of companies who want to place electric mobility in Arnhem now for shared mobility. And if they don't have their own charging equipment, because some have, if they don't have that, we say, okay, make a deal with the CPO. And then you can get a place in our one of our neighborhoods to place your car. And so now, actually, we are asked by several neighborhoods to cooperate on this field. So it's I don't think it's difficult, because we get lots of questions about that.
Also, just very quickly to add on to that, shared mobility, especially in the context of app-based
ride hailing, I think from a total cost of ownership perspective, makes a lot of sense. And that will be one of the first kind of use cases for faster adoption. I mean, it's cheaper to run an electric vehicle in most parts of the world. It's more kind of expensive to own them or to buy them upfront. But the more you run an electric vehicle, of course, the cheaper it gets. So from a fleet perspective, both kind of these fleets provide better total cost of ownership, but also they have the scale to and the data to determine where do they need the chargers, how can they reduce their dry runs, and they can give some sort of a guarantee to a charge point operator in terms of demand offtake, which makes it easier to raise private capital to deploy chargers. So I think this is a segment, especially in the context of kind of app-based ride hailing, where there is a lot of scale. I think this is a perfect use case for EV adoption or early EV adoption around the world.
Just give another example, what we've seen in Flanders. We have a lot of local authorities who actually change their own fleets for shared cars, and in many cases shared electric cars. And what they do is they use the shared electric cars during the day for professional meetings and visits. And during the evening and then the weekend, they open the system for citizens living in the neighborhood or companies in the neighborhood, and they can make use of the fleet of the local government, the shared electric fleet. And in this way, you stimulate the uptake of shared mobility, and you actually save money and save place, and you have a way more efficient use of those cars. So that can be a good example. And another one is what Peter already mentioned. We are building currently a lot of mobility hubs in Flanders. We call them mobipunten or hop-in-punten, and basically means that you make sure all kind of shared transport modes are coming together in one hub, and you include charging infrastructure, you include electric shared cars, and in this way you stimulate the use of those kind of vehicles.
Interesting comment from the audience. It's not really a question. I think it's more of a very interesting proposal. It says, at our office, we use driveamber.com for shared EV, and it is mandatory for business trips for everyone. Works perfectly, and no one wants to drive a car anymore. Perhaps make this mandatory for all business cars, shared and leased. What do you think?
I'm sorry, but I don't think that we as a public authority are authorized to make this mandatory for businesses, but it sounds like a nice idea anyway.
If I may just respond to the comment of Peter, I think public authorities can actually stimulate it at least, maybe not make it mandatory, but with a correct fiscal policy, you can of course make sure that these fleets are electrified.
Yeah, you can always encourage it.
So we've seen many companies who actually started doing this. So it's possible if you use as a company an existing sharing system, but it's really difficult once you will share your own fleet, because you have insurance issues, and that's kind of complicated. But for small companies and those who only need cars for specific purposes, of course, we encourage them to make use of those existing systems. But yeah, we have no obligation whatsoever for all companies to have this kind of approach.
Yeah, and at our project in WBCSD, corporate fleets and just fleet-based adoption of EVs is a very strong focus, and we have an online guide, and anyone can search for it. It's called the EV Adoption Guide, which gives any company which is looking to adopt EVs for its own kind of both people transport but also goods transfer, can use that guide as a ready reckoner for a lot of information on adopting EVs for their own use, and we promote and support business action on this front.
Well, there's time for a last question. This one is about solar panels. It says, which opportunities for private solar panels producer so that the cars use their power to charge could be given? For instance, potential role of private chargers for cars.
Sorry. I have one small example maybe that, as I mentioned in the presentation, but also in the chat, that our current CPO, Allego, is working on a project which they call preferred supplier, and that means that a EV driver can choose which energy he wants to charge in his car. Well, if you that is very administrative action, of course. But what you can do is that the EV driver can also choose his own energy company, and his own energy company, of course, is also the company which gets, I think, the energy which his house produces when it's not using the energy itself. So that's maybe one of the possible ways to use your own produced energy in your own car. If you cannot, of course, connect it directly at your house, because a lot of people do that, of course.
Also, I mean, it depends how you're looking to charge from solar. One is from an accounting perspective. So you could always buy solar power separately if it is allowed in your regulatory area to buy solar power to charge your car. But I think from a theoretical perspective, to make sure that your car is charged more and more from solar, you want to charge it during the day, right? Which is not the cheapest in most kind of at least developed countries, but an ideal candidate for ensuring that your car is charged during the day is because most of you take your car to work during the day. Workplace charging and promoting workplace charging is the easiest way to make sure your car is being charged from solar, because that's when solar is the kind of has the highest penetration on the grid.
What to add on this one?
Well, I just wanted to add that in Flanders, we already have the obligation for all public charges within the concession system. They have to make use of renewable energy. We also are lucky, I must say, or I don't know whether this is a good thing, but we are lucky in Belgium that we have quite a widespread people live everywhere basically, and they have a lot of parking opportunities in their houses, and most of them also have, or a lot of them who invest in an EV also have already solar panels on their roof. And we also have a subsidy system for a home battery to be sure to make as much as possible use of the renewable energy and also use it to charge the vehicle. But those are kind of different systems, so we have no central system. We had some purchase premiums for electric vehicles in the past as well. So yeah, we work on all those things separately, and sometimes they all come together in one house.
Simon, it's time now to go to the coffee break. It will be a long one. It's 30 minutes. You all have time to visit the expo if you want. There are a lot of very interesting European funded projects displayed, all of them about mobility. And in the next session, we will speak about interesting projects related to public funding for infrastructure, vehicle to everything, or interoperability, standards, smart charging, etc. So please come again by 11, and we will start sharp. So please try to be a little bit in advance. Well, have fun.